The climate of planet Earth is changing. The natural order is being turned upside down. Millions of people may be at risk. Global warming takes centre stage. A crucial climate summit is about to get underway here in Doha, in Qatar. I'm Nick Clark. Welcome to part 2 of this Al Jazeera special.
Against this towering backdrop, politicians, scientists and activists are gathering here in Doha for a major UN conference on climate change. On the table, a need to reach consensus in tackling what many say is a very real threat to the world we live in. But after 2 decades of talks, nations are still at odds over what to do. And scientists are saying time is running out.
Coming up, I'll speak with CHRISTIANA, the UN's climate change chief. And, taking matters into their own hands, how a Thai businessman found his own solution to preventing vehicle emissions. Also ahead, polar bears under threat. We'll take you to the Arctic to find out the impact of climate change on wildlife there.
First up, in this modern world, the need to balance the course of progress with an eye to sustainability and conservation is absolutely paramount. And that's a battle that's been fought out every single day, a long way from here in the Amazon, from where Gabriel Elizondo sent this report.
It's the most biodiverse place on Earth, the Amazon, making up a quarter of all the world's plants and animals, and with the world's second longest river, the Brazilian Amazon makes up 1/3 of the remaining forests left on the planet, but protecting this great treasure is a challenge. Roughly 8,000 square kilometers of rainforest are cut down in Brazil every year, brown blotches of clear-cut forest. Sometimes it's the iconic image of the Amazon to the outside world. Solving the riddle of Amazon deforestation is complex. Cattle ranching accounts for more than half of all deforestation, and Brazil is the world's second largest exporter of beef. As demand grows, so too does the demand for land for cattle to graze. And then there is agriculture, a major driver of economic growth in Brazil, but it's often competing for space with the forest. As you can see, there's still native forest that exists here. This patch is protected by federal laws. Now, it was just over 3 decades ago that the Brazilian government was actually offering financial incentives for farmers to colonize this area of the Amazon because they wanted to bring economic development here. As you can see, that's exactly what's happened. This is a huge soy farm. It goes on for as far as the eye can see, and there are literally thousands of them all over this region of Brazil. As Brazil's demands for energy increase, the government sees the Amazon as a source of energy and is building more than a dozen hydroelectric dams, which critics say has devastating environmental and social consequences. But government officials say that stepped-up enforcement has led to a 70% fall in deforestation in the past 8 years, and that roughly 82% of the native forest in Brazil is still standing. How to curtail illegal logging and how to balance the need for energy, soy, and beef against the need to protect the Amazon, that's a question for the world to solve, but no more so than in Brazil, a country blessed with the Amazon, but also with the highest responsibility of protecting it for tomorrow and beyond. Gabriel Elizondo, Al Jazeera, Brazil.
The Qatar Convention Centre, where, over the next few days, the arguments, the negotiations and the science will be thrashed out.
Now, hosting a conference of this size with 17,000 delegates coming comes with its very own carbon challenges. Think of the thousands of flights, the thousands of hotel rooms, the air conditioning being pumped out. But this building, we're told, comes with its very own focus on sustainability. And one thing that means is it's partly powered by the sun. 3,700 square meters of solar panels apparently accounts for 12% of energy usage here. You might think it would be more given the amount of sun we get, but I guess it's a start. Well, these UN-sponsored talks have been going on for 2 decades now. What's been achieved in that time?
In 1990, a UN panel concludes that man-made greenhouse gases are increasing the temperature of the Earth. They call for action. After 7 years of negotiations, the Kyoto Protocol is born. All of the world's industrialised nations sign on. They pledge to reduce emissions to below 1990 levels. That accord finally takes effect in 2005, but by then it's greatly watered down. The United States, which initially signed on, does not ratify the deal and does not have to meet any of its obligations. And China, the world's biggest polluter, is not required to reduce emissions. The Kyoto Protocol expires at the end of this year. What comes next? That's partly what this summit is all about.
This is the main plenary hall where all the big number speeches will be made. There'll be a lot of lobbying, a lot of debating going on here. And a woman who's going to spend a good deal of her time in this hall is Christina Figueres, who's the UN Climate Change Chief. And I've already spoken to her in our studio here in Doha.
Governments need to ensure that the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol will actually start promptly on the 1st of January of 2013. They've already decided that it will, but they need to decide what are the rules that are going to govern that second commitment period.
It's not working, is it? CO2 levels are still going up, temperatures are still rising. The world's biggest industrialized nation isn't even acting on it, hasn't even ratified it, United States. It's just not working.
Well, actually, the Kyoto Protocol is working if you see who is under the Kyoto Protocol. So developing countries are not under the Kyoto Protocol, so they have no obligation there. Who is under the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol are the industrialized countries, minus the United States that exited immediately, and Canada that exited later.
Why do you think the sense of urgency that's demonstrated by the scientists does not reflect on the way politicians are acting? Why is there this big gap?
There is a gap because the science, of course, looks at the planet from the atmosphere's perspective and sees the concentrations going up. The politicians see these decisions from their own respective countries' point of view. And they understand that they need to balance here, on the one hand, what science is telling them as a collective effort, but on the other hand, what each of them individually can do at that point in time.
So how do you narrow the gap?
I think you narrow the gap by the trend that we have been seeing over the past 2 to 3 years, which is more and more countries taking on nationally, legally binding climate change legislation because it's in their own interest. And that's the interesting thing.
Right, but that's the thing. Like, how are you going to get to that point when you've got somebody like the United States who haven't even ratified the Kyoto Protocol? You've got President Obama saying that he doesn't want a future which is implicated by global warming. But on the other hand, saying that if mitigation means job losses, then it's a non-starter.
Because mitigation does not necessarily mean job losses, quite to the contrary. It means a birth of a whole new economy in green jobs that is going to bring new types of jobs, new opportunities to supply electricity, but also, very importantly, new export opportunities that are going to create not only jobs, but actually export economy.
That doesn't apply to a developing nation like India. If you applied the sort of restrictions that people are talking about, that it would impede progress, wouldn't it, and affect the lives of millions?
No, I don't think so. And nobody is expecting developing countries to impede their progress or to slow their growth. The opportunity here is to support developing countries in the growth that they must pursue, and nobody is questioning that because they must. They're only just coming into their very accelerated growth. The difference is that these countries are going to have the challenge of pursuing that growth while at the same time reducing the carbon emissions, which means decoupling economic growth from carbon emissions. That's very difficult, and that is certainly not what the North has taught us, because the North did both of those two things together. So it's that decoupling that is going to be challenging, and for which the countries, in particular the emerging countries, are going to need support, both technically and financially, but it's doable.
Now, sunshine is one thing that the desert is not short of, but typically it's too hot to allow plants to grow, and there's not enough fresh water anyway. But here at the Sahara Forest Project in the south of Qatar is a pioneering new project whereby the energy of the sun is being used to water the plants and to keep the environment they grow in cool. The salt is taken out of the seawater, and the process creates cool air in the greenhouses. And the end result is cucumbers. Still early days with this project, but all around the world, people are coming up with new ideas and new innovations in the battle to beat the consequences of global warming. Wayne Hay has this report from Bangkok.
Thailand's economy is growing and wages are increasing. That results in more vehicles on the roads and more pollution in the air. But the streets of Bangkok are already clogged. For the many food vendors who make a living on the roadside, the air can be toxic.
It is noisy and smoky. My health is getting worse. I often have a cold and a headache.
Respective governments have made inroads into the problem, converting taxis and some public transport buses to natural gas. But there is still clearly a long way to go, and policing of the problem is weak. Carbon monoxide levels have been reduced, but the amount of harmful particles has increased. Tucked away in suburban Bangkok, an architect and antiques collector believes he has a solution. It's a small device that attaches to any vehicle's exhaust pipe. He and his fellow inventor say it results in a cleaner, more efficient burn.
If we can suck out the bad air and replace it with fresh air, the engine can run properly. Our system creates a vacuum.
The device has caught the attention of some large companies, but they've said it needs some modifications before it can be taken further. Test results have varied, but the inventors say it will reduce fuel consumption by more than 1/3. The world's governments are meeting at this year's conference in Doha to try to hammer out a deal on climate change. However, there's little hope for any worldwide agreement to reduce emissions before 2020. The levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are steadily rising. But as long as there's innovation and ideas, the prospect of cleaner air will stay alive. Wayne Hay, Al Jazeera, Bangkok.
One of the main aims of the UN climate change talks is to get countries to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases they pump out. According to the latest data published in 2010, China is the world's biggest polluter. It emits over 8 billion tons of greenhouse gases. The United States comes in second, producing just more than 5 billion tons. But this amount has decreased since 2007. India's rapidly growing manufacturing sector has made it the third worst polluter in the world. It emits nearly 2 billion tons of CO2. And then there's Russia. It produced about 1.6 billion tons of emissions.
You know, it's interesting to note that just 10 countries are responsible for 80% of the world's CO2 emissions, and most of them are also the world's richest countries, and it's the world's poorest nations that suffer the most. Let's hear from GOWHER RIZVI, who is the foreign advisor to the Prime Minister of Bangladesh.
If a third of Bangladesh goes underwater, some 60 million people will be displaced. And what will happen to these climate refugees? They will spread in all directions. So the entire world has a stake in Bangladesh's concerns for climate change. To begin with, the developed world, industrial world, will have to understand that their current lifestyle based on consumption, huge wasteful consumption, is not sustainable. They must adapt to the new realities. They must pollute less, and the way to pollute less is to consume less, to waste less, and at the same time understand that global warming is a global phenomenon, and there will be no oasis. And therefore, we are all equally vulnerable to global warming, and therefore we need to work at it together.
So let's go to the United States now, a country where there is no comprehensive policy on climate change. It is the world's richest industrialized nation, and it's a country where scientists are now linking recent extreme weather events with global warming. Rob Reynolds has this report.
The ravages of Hurricane Sandy may top $50 billion, making it one of the costliest storms ever. No single weather event can be blamed solely on global warming, but scientists at places like the Earth System Science Center at the University of Maryland are drawing conclusions about the connections between extreme weather and the warming atmosphere.
Here's an example.
Antonio BUSALACCHI is the center's director.
There's no doubt that the background climate around the world is warming. On top of that warming trend, we're going to have extreme events. And the two are actually conflated together.
This summer, a record-breaking drought ravaged the Midwest, destroying crops and boosting food prices.
It's estimated that about half of our growth in GDP this past year, half of it is going to be lost from the drought.
But severe weather is but one side of the cost the U.S. pays for burning oil, coal, and gas.
Literally, we're choking on our pollution, and tens of thousands of people die every year from mercury, billions of tons of sulfur dioxide, a whole host of pollutants. These are real medical costs.
Stunning as they are, those costs pale in comparison with the havoc rising sea levels could wreak on U.S. cities in the future, scientists say.
Houston, New Orleans, Miami, Washington, D.C., up in terms of the Chesapeake Bay of Potomac, Boston, New York, the big population centers, by design, are near water.
Scientists say if a storm the size of Hurricane Sandy were to hit Washington, this entire area, the heart of the nation's capital, would be underwater. And yet, efforts to enact a national climate policy remain stagnant. What is wanted, economists say, is a way of reflecting the true cost of pumping carbon into the air.
What we really do need is to look at something that's more broadly based in the economy. A carbon tax is probably the simplest way to do it.
In President Barack Obama's first term, efforts to set a cap on carbon emissions and require companies to pay for emissions over their allowed limit failed to get through Congress. The administration has cut emissions with higher energy efficiency standards for vehicles and appliances. But in his first post-re-election press conference, Obama said more progress won't be easy.
There's no doubt that for us to take on climate change in a serious way would involve making some tough political choices. If the message is somehow we're going to ignore jobs and growth simply to address climate change, I don't think anybody's going to go for that.
The science, economics, and politics of global warming are complicated, but one conclusion is simple. If we just keep doing what we are doing now, it's likely only going to get worse. Rob Reynolds, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Think of the just colossal quantity of waste mankind produces every single year all around the world. It takes a huge amount of energy to produce, and most of it just gets dumped into landfill. Recycling schemes like this one at Doha Plastics have not yet taken off in the way they need to in Gulf countries. They're only just beginning to happen. Believe it or not, this lot will re-emerge as oil barrels, road barriers, even seats for football stadiums. What you're looking at is recycling plastic, the byproduct of the oil industry. But still, the vast majority gets dumped, especially domestic waste.
It's as much about changing people's mindsets as anything, and that's the focus of a young climate change activist who attended the UN talks in Durban last year and is coming to Doha as a youth delegate this year.
I speak for more than half the world's population.
My name's ANJALI, APPADURAI.
You've been negotiating all my life.
I'm 22 years old.
In that time, you've failed to meet pledges, you've missed targets, and you've broken promises.
I care about this issue because to me it's fundamentally a human rights issue. It's about the environment, yes, but the environment cannot be separated from the fate of humans everywhere.
The International Energy Agency tells us we have 5 years until the window to avoid irreversible climate change closes. The science tells us that we have 5 years maximum. You're saying, give us 10. The most stark betrayal of your generation's responsibility to ours is that you call this ambition.
Nature is not waiting for us to come to some sort of slow political outcome.
You've given us a seat in this hall, but our interests are not on the table.
Because of the scientific nature of the problem, we are going to be feeling the effects more, disproportionately more than our parents' generation.
What does it take to get a stake in this game? Lobbyists, corporate influence, money?
And it's important that we have a say in that process. There's really not enough youth participation in the UN. We're not allowed into most of the meetings. We're not allowed into most of the spaces where the decisions are made. And I think that's something that needs to change. And to sort of pigeonhole youth into this box of naive, inexperienced, unable to handle what's going on, unable to understand the issues, is to seriously undermine potential for the next generation to take the torch.
Of course, it's not only humans that are facing up to global warming. All kinds of wildlife are feeling the heat too, especially in the Arctic. I travelled across Baffin Bay from Greenland to Canada to explore the consequences of climate change.
On the remote island of KIGUKTAK, a spotter is on the lookout for whales. Below, a hunting party has just returned. It's narwhal season. And first, they share pieces of muktak, or skin. Some money is made by selling slabs of muktak in Karnak, 2 hours boat ride away. It all helps this tiny community last out the year.
You know, it's hard to reconcile the whole climate change movement with its conferences, its arguments over policy, its politics, its debates, with this tiny community deep in the Arctic, just doing what they've always done for hundreds of years. And yet, this is the front line of global warming.
Over the next few days, we head across Baffin Bay for the Canadian Arctic. Time for Paul, our onboard scientist, to take samples from the depths. While on the surface, the summer's record retreat of the Arctic sea ice is very evident. There's none to be seen.
The sea ice is really important for the life that lives here because it's adapted over thousands of years to the presence of the ice. So everything from tiny little single-celled creatures, the sorts of things that Paul's been studying on this trip, up to 100-ton bowhead whales, they all have their niche that relies on the ice and the flux of nutrients through that ice.
And as a crucial environment disappears into the sea, we make Canadian landfall at GRISE fjord and find a remote community whose beach is getting smaller.
The high tide, I can see big difference in it now. The shacks that are on the beach, they never used to be reached by waves, but now they do.
The big retreat of sea ice made it hard for us to see these guys, but Arctic veteran Pascal Otis has filmed them many times.
There's many encounters with polar bears over the years, feeding on shore on plants and whatnot.
And look at this one here with the 2 cubs following behind.
Yeah, that was a mother with 2 cubs, probably cubs that are 2 years old. They're quite big, so you can clearly see that they're just big, fat, and healthy bears.
Just how threatened are they? Because the impression that we get from the outside world, as it were, is that they're really under the cosh.
Well, I think that impression is correct if you're looking into the future as the sea ice recedes, because they rely so heavily on that sea ice. As one of the noted polar bear biologists has said, no ice, no bears.
As our trip ends, the physical impact of global warming is very apparent. Animal life is still abundant, but what will the warming seas mean for those species who rely on the ice? And what of those for whom the annual ebb and flow of sea ice is as much a part of them and their culture as the very blood in their bodies? There is no doubt the children of the far north are walking into a very different world from their forefathers.
Well, finally, what about the future for the Earth we all live on? As we look ahead to these climate talks, the truth is the gap between the action scientists say is necessary and what governments have actually done has widened. Emissions around the world are increasing, not falling. The planet has adapted many times before to global warming and cooling, and it will do so again. But will mankind? After all, there's nowhere else to go.